8 symptoms of a bad intake manifold gasket and why you should not ignore these signs. Your engine may still start, your car may still drive, but if the intake manifold gasket goes bad, it can create vacuum leaks, coolant leaks, rough running, and a check engine light. Because the intake manifold gasket does an important job. It helps seal the connection between the intake manifold and the engine. That seal matters because the engine needs controlled airflow. And on some engines, it also helps keep coolant where it belongs. So when the gasket fails, air or coolant can leak where it should not. And that can lead to a very confusing mix of symptoms. In this video, I will show you 8 common symptoms of a bad intake manifold gasket. We will start with the most common signs first, then move into the more serious ones. So before you replace random parts, let's go step by step. Symptom number 1, rough idle. This is one of the most common signs. If the intake manifold gasket leaks, extra air can enter the engine without being measured properly. That creates a vacuum leak. And once the air-fuel mixture gets thrown off, the engine may idle rough. You may notice shaking, vibration, or an uneven idle while the car is stopped. Sometimes it feels mild. Other times it feels like the engine is struggling to stay smooth. Symptom number 2, high idle or fluctuating RPM. A leaking intake manifold gasket can also cause the engine to idle higher than normal or make the RPM move up and down. This happens because the engine is getting extra unmetered air. And once that happens, idle control becomes unstable. The RPM may rise, drop, then rise again, or the idle may stay too high even when the engine is warm. If idle speed suddenly changes without a clear reason, a vacuum leak from the intake gasket should be considered. Symptom number 3, check engine light. A bad intake manifold gasket can easily trigger the check engine light. That is because a vacuum leak can cause the engine to run too lean. And when the computer sees a mixture problem, misfire, or idle issue, it may turn on the warning light. Sometimes the code points to a lean condition, misfire, or airflow-related problems. That is why this issue often gets misdiagnosed, because people replace sensors first, when the real problem is a leaking gasket. Symptom number 4, engine misfire. If the leak becomes bad enough, one or more cylinders may not get the correct air-fuel mixture, and when that happens, the engine may misfire. You may feel shaking, stumbling, jerking, or rough running, especially at idle or during light acceleration. Sometimes the misfire is small, other times it becomes obvious very quickly. This is one reason a bad intake manifold gasket should not be ignored, because what starts as a small vacuum leak can turn into serious drivability problems. Symptom number 5, poor acceleration or hesitation. Here is another common complaint. You press the gas pedal, but the engine does not respond the way it should. The car may hesitate, it may feel weak, or it may accelerate less smoothly than before. This happens because the engine depends on a balanced mixture for proper performance, and when the gasket leaks, that balance gets disturbed. Now, this symptom alone does not prove the gasket is bad, because hesitation can also come from spark plugs, fuel injectors, or sensor problems. But if it appears together with rough, idle misfire or a check engine light, the intake manifold gasket becomes much more suspicious. Symptom number 6, hissing sound from the engine area. A leaking intake manifold gasket can sometimes create a hissing sound. That sound is caused by air being pulled in through the leak. Since vacuum leaks often make a hissing noise, this can be a useful clue. Sometimes the sound is faint. Other times you can hear it clearly from around the intake manifold area. If you hear a new hissing sound together with rough, idle, or lean condition symptoms, do not ignore it. It may be pointing directly to an intake air leak. Symptom number 7, coolant loss or coolant leak. On some engines, the intake manifold gasket also seals coolant passages. So when the gasket fails, coolant may begin to leak. You may notice coolant level dropping, a visible coolant leak, or signs of coolant around the intake area. In some cases, the coolant leak is external. In other cases, coolant may leak internally, which can become much more serious. This depends on the engine design, but on engines where the intake gasket handles coolant sealing, this is a very important sign. Symptom number 8, engine overheating or milky oil in severe cases. And finally, one of the more serious outcomes. If a failed intake manifold gasket causes coolant loss, the engine may begin to overheat. And in more severe cases, if coolant leaks internally, it may contaminate the oil. That can create milky oil or sludge-like residue. Now, this does not happen in every intake gasket failure, but when it does, the problem becomes much more serious because overheating or coolant contamination can lead to engine damage if ignored too long. Now here is the big takeaway. A bad intake manifold gasket can cause symptoms that look like a vacuum leak, a sensor problem, a fuel issue, or even a cooling system problem. That is why it often gets misdiagnosed. So if you suspect a bad intake manifold gasket, pay attention to the pattern. Is the idle rough? Is RPM unstable? Did the check engine light come on? Is the engine misfiring? Do you hear hissing? Is coolant disappearing? Is the engine starting to overheat? If several of those signs show up together, the intake manifold gasket should definitely be checked. And remember, sometimes the leak is mainly air, other times it is coolant. And on some engines, it can be both. So do not replace random parts blindly. So let's quickly recap. A bad intake manifold gasket may cause rough idle, high idle, or fluctuating RPM, a check engine light, engine misfire, poor acceleration or hesitation, a hissing sound, coolant loss or coolant leak, and overheating or milky oil in severe cases. It may seem like just a gasket, but when it fails, it can create both performance and cooling-related problems. And now I want to hear from you. What symptom did your car show first? Was it rough idle, a check engine light, a misfire, or disappearing coolant? Comment below with the first sign you noticed. And if enough people mention the same one, I will make the next video on how to test a bad intake manifold gasket step by step.